This is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt with your hosts, Mark Garrigus and Gary Smith.
Welcome to BRD, special Saturday edition, because Adam was kind enough to let us do the big show in the middle of the week. But, you know, there's been quite a bit of news going on, including at the U.S. Supreme Court. So Gary and I thought we'd weigh in. But first, an interesting article. You know, we've had on Karen Agnifilo, who used to be at the Manhattan DA's office, talking about those two resignations. And there was an article today kind of on the scuttlebutt of what was going on in the office there. And this has to do with the Trump prosecution. Apparently, Alvin Bragg, the new Manhattan DA, was not buying what they were selling when he was presented with the kind of the updates of it. And they were up against it because the grand jury had to do something by the spring. But something in that article today, Gary, was interesting to me. If we have Karen back on, I'm going to ask her. Apparently, because a lot of people were saying, you know, is it political? Wasn't it political? Buried in that article was that there were three other deputies who early on resigned. And it sounded like for the opposite reasons, didn't it? Did you get that impression?
Yeah, I sure did. It's a fascinating article on the New York Times website that people can go find. I did notice that as well. It was weird the way the article was worded, because it was almost as though that was throwaway information, as though they were intending to they had to have it in there so that when people fact checked them, it would be correct, but it was buried in such a way that it wasn't highlighted.
Which I didn't quite understand, because to me, that was a classic bearing the lead, LEDE, that the fact was, when you're asking the question, why did these two, Pomerantz and the other, Dunn, resign now? We've got basically that story's been swirling around for a week or two. But then midway through the article is that three deputies apparently resigned prior to this, and it appears that it was for the opposite reason that these deputies resigned, which, by the way, wouldn't that be a headline story? You
would think. And I'll even drill down on it a bit further. It's almost as though it was about a third or halfway through the article, they announced that two of them had resigned, and then it was 7 or 8 graphs later that they threw away that a third one had also resigned, as though it was non-consequential information. It was very strange to me. That I noticed that as well.
Yeah, and I think we bring Karen back on, and I do a little quizzing on this, because I hadn't known that before. Maybe it's been reported before, but certainly in the broader context, I think it's something that deserves a little exploration. Then yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty for the Boston bomber, and which I think was expected. Anybody who had followed the case had seen that the circuit court had reversed the death penalty. And based on the questioning, once it got up to the U.S. Supreme Court, people expected, and certainly enough, 6-3, that it did, would get reinstated. But, and we can talk about that, the death penalty is always a hot button issue, even though I tend to agree with the people who say the machinery is broken in the criminal justice system. I would go farther that I think the entire criminal justice system is broken or irretrievably broken. That's a different story. Buried in that opinion was an interesting footnote. I sent it to you here. Do you have it?
Yes.
It was footnote 2.
From Thomas.
And it was from Clarence Thomas. And the reason this is interesting is basically, if you just paraphrase it or read it, Gary, and then I'll kind of riff on it.
Sure, no problem. It says here, some have argued that these cases and their progeny do not reflect the original meaning of the Eighth Amendment, whose prohibition, quote, relates to the character of the punishment and not the process by which it is imposed, unquote. Neither party here asks us to revisit that question, and we decline to do so.
Yeah, what Clarence Thomas is doing, and he cites two cases. One is a dissent by Rehnquist. The other is a dissent by
Thomas.
Clarence Thomas. Yeah. he is putting out there, in my humble opinion, he's throwing red meat to prosecutors to now argue that you no longer have the ability to put on what's called mitigation evidence in a death penalty proceeding in the penalty phase. And why do I say that? Because he's saying Eighth Amendment is only to punishment itself. It's not to the process of obtaining that punishment. If that's the case, I predict you're going to see in penalty phases around the country, prosecutors are going to start arguing that mitigation evidence is irrelevant because there's no due process that's required for the penalty phase. And I think Thomas is too clever by half. That's exactly what he's setting this up for. And so I predict, save the tape, that that's going to be the next wave in prosecutions when it comes to death penalties. Then, speaking of strange bedfellows, there was also a dissent in another case. And I just sent this over to Gary, a U.S. Supreme Court case. In this case, Gary, who are the two dissenters? You'd never guess this, I think. Gorsuch and Sotomayor.
Correct.
And this is the case coming out of the Ninth Circuit, where one of the Guantanamo detainees is suing, and because on behalf of basically Polish prosecutors who are criminally investigating black sites that were held there back in the early 2000s by the CIA in order to, black sites are generally for what they call enhanced interrogation. In this case, they have already conceded and declassified that this particular gentleman was waterboarded 80 times, kept in a cell, basically to the point where he was gurgling and everything else. And then at the end of it, the two independent contractors admitted this guy probably didn't know anything because he couldn't have withstood this. So they've now initiated a criminal investigation in Poland. They've already declassified most of this information. There is a statute, I think what is it, Gary, 1782 or something under the United States Code, which allows for somebody to proceed here. And basically the majority said no. They dismissed, or they basically reversed the ninth and reinstated what the district court had done, and did not allow them to proceed. There's some really good language. What's the first sentence of Gorsuch's dissent there? Joined, as I said, by Sotomayor.
There comes a point where we should not be ignorant as judges of what we know to be true as citizens.
I love that quote.
It's great.
And he goes through, it's worth a read, especially if you follow these kinds of things. The dissent starts at page 48 of the opinion. And it is, as I've always said, I think Gorsuch is a spectacular writer. I don't always agree with where he goes, but the writing is always clear and persuasive and kind of lyrical. And in this case, I think he does a really nice job of dismantling what is called the state secrets privilege. And that is it's worth a read if you're a lawyer, because I think it's an interesting take. It's also interesting what's happened here. There's quite some shuffling of the U.S. Supreme Court as of late. You're noticing that Amy Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh have started to kind of coalesce themselves. You notice that Gorsuch has his own, he's starting to kind of construct, if you will, a path that you can somewhat predict. And Sotomayor as well is the joining of these two in the dissent, I think, is an interesting melding of left and right when it comes to government overreach. Yeah. And that's interesting too, because that's a subject that is going to get litigated constantly in the next couple of years.
Why? What's been going on? Sorry, it's been a long weekend babysitting. I'm a little punchy, but I just.
Yeah. Well, And then I'll let the last subject be up to you. What do you want to close us with today?
I mean, you sent me an interesting story about an Amtrak engineer out of Philadelphia that I admit I was woefully unaware of. So I'll let you pick. I'm going to flip it back on you. You want to talk about that, or do you want to read the rest of what you sent me from Gorsuch? Because I agree, it's beautifully written, and I found it. I chuckled a couple times. So
why don't we pivot to the Amtrak engineer?
Absolutely.
And then, because as long as we're talking about government overreach, this was a tragic accident, and I say accident purposefully, that had happened in the state of Pennsylvania. The lawyer who tried the case, fun fact, Brian, is the same lawyer who got the hung jury the first time around for Bill Cosby. And, right. And Brian tried this case. Mind you, what a tortured history. The engineer on the train that entered into a curve, supposedly at too high of a speed, that ended up killing and injuring people and doing, a great deal of property damage, was investigated. The case was rejected. By the district attorney, so the county or the municipality. The attorney general then stepped in, and I may be getting the dismissals wrong.
So far, you're right.
Twice this case was dismissed by judges. Twice. Not once, but twice. Because they said, while it is a horrific accident, it doesn't rise to the level of criminal negligence. Meaning, sometimes there are just accidents, and you can't just ascribe crimes to them. Twice, two different judges dismissed the thing. The third judge, in its infinite wisdom, came along and said, no, let a jury decide. Well, a jury did decide, and a jury decided that it was an accident, that it was not a crime, and acquitted this engineer.
Over 200
how long is this
charges.
case? Yeah. I mean, it was a prosecutorial pylon in this case, and I think people want justice. I understand that, but justice doesn't always mean a criminal conviction, right?
Right. And to your point, after it was rejected by a couple of judges, the state's attorney general, I believe, based on my reading, stepped in after being pressured by some of the families of victims who understandably want justice and want to see things happen. But, they're also distraught. And, sometimes, as you said, an accident is just an accident. And in reading about it, it sounds like there were bystanders throwing projectiles at the train, and this young.
Well, that was exactly right. That's what he did. That's what it was testified to, that he was worried about what was happening. There were projectiles being thrown at him. And
he was just trying to get out. It seemed like he was, erroneously was not aware of the track ahead of him necessarily, and was trying to evade projectiles that were being thrown at his train. So, it's a heartbreaking case, but it seems like justice was served to a certain extent here.
Right. If I get a hold of Brian, maybe we'll have him come on and talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's end with reading the rest of that Gorsuch, because I love that. I love that quote.
All right. Well, I'm going to read the whole thing because the top is just fun. So we'll hear it again. There comes a point where we should not be ignorant as judges of what we know to be true as citizens. See Watts v. Indiana. This case takes us well past that point. Zebediah seeks information about his torture at the hands of the CIA. The events in question took place 2 decades ago. They have long been declassified. Official reports have been published, books written, and movies made about them. Still, the government seeks to have this suit dismissed on the ground that it implicates a state secret, and today the court acquiesces in that request. Ending this suit may shield the government from some torture, from some further modest measure of embarrassment, but respectfully, we should not pretend it will safeguard any secret.
Like I say, that's the truer words were never spoken. But remember, it was the dissent that did not carry the day. It did unify the most, not the most right, but one of the stalwarts on the right with one of the stalwarts on the left. So I found that to be significant.
Not often that those pairs of three cross over the one in the middle. So encouraging, I would say.
And I'll end with, speaking of the Constitution, I saw Elie Mystal, who has written a book, and his appearance on The View went viral. I think you should reach out to him and see if he'll come on Tuesday. I'd like to talk to him.
I will. We will look into that.
Okay, got it. Gary, have a great weekend. Go back to babysitting duties.
I will. Mark, thank you so much for your time. You have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. Stay tuned for more bonus episodes coming soon.